Again, I cannot pretend to have all the wisdom on the subject. I simply don't. Nevertheless, I think there are one or two key issues. One that has struck me very forcefully is that both the major parties have converged on a basic stratagem involving carbon trading, emissions trading. If one looks at the schemes that have been put up to this point as policies, they're fairly sketchy with respect to detail. And one issue that I think is absolutely crucial for the success of any carbon emissions trading scheme is that the regulation and oversight over the actual abatement is a key element, and I haven't seen that to date. It seems to me that there's a very significant potential for a lot of middlemen to get very wealthy, for a lot of trading to go on, but not necessarily to end up in actual abatement of greenhouse emissions. So if I were in the Parliament, I can assure you I would scrutinize any legislation to introduce a carbon trading scheme to within an inch of its life, because it really needs to be very thoroughly thought through in order to have the effect we want it to have. Well, I've been a researcher for 25 years, and one thing that I've come to appreciate is that you should never underestimate the capacity to invent, to develop, to improve, and to innovate. And I think that we need to be very much more optimistic about the capacity of alternative energy to provide baseload. In the meantime, what we can do is try to make sensible efforts to reduce the peak demand on hot summer days at midday on the current system of producing energy essentially through coal. And there's some obvious things that we can do there. We can have smart metering and make it much more expensive in the middle part of the day. There's just too many initiatives that we haven't really tried. So I frankly don't yet buy the argument that we cannot and are unable to provide baseload through other means. Yes, it'll take time to develop, but if we put all of our eggs in the so-called clean coal basket, then we will not be spending the money that we need to encourage, promote, and develop these alternatives. And I think in a generation's time, people will look back and they will be horrified if that's the pessimistic route that we take. I'm completely opposed to nuclear power. And this is not just because there's the issue of nuclear waste, for example, in local communities. I'm extremely concerned that when people think about nuclear power, they ignore the other aspect of the nuclear equation, which is weapons. And while we're going through a period now, following the end of the Cold War, where people feel, or at least many people I think, feel that there's no longer a real threat posed by nuclear weapons, I don't think that's true. If we look at a country such as Pakistan, which just in this last couple of days has gone through another political upheaval, and is certainly not a stable part of the world, have a little read about the ways in which many people in Pakistan are jubilant about their acquisition of nuclear weapons and technology. I'm very afraid that if we don't take those issues seriously and we trundle down a path of nuclear power generation, uranium exports and so forth, that we will not be doing all that we can to reduce what is actually a much more significant threat still to this planet. Actually, I don't. I believe that we should bite the bullet and take the necessary measures to initially cap and over time phase out uranium mining. I suppose one issue that's very fundamental to me is electoral reform. And the reason why I think that this is so important is that, to me, it's a little bit like a gardener. If you go out and you work in your garden on the weekend and you want to plant a vegetable garden, if you've got a broken spade, you won't do the job. And I think in many respects now we have a somewhat broken electoral and parliamentary system. And it's broken in two ways. One is that the electoral system requires clarification and simplification. We have, for example, a system of voting for the Senate that is really very unfair and unnecessarily unfair. We could have optional preferential voting so that people only have to fill out a certain number of names without having to tick off just what the parties want. The second aspect of that is that I have been quite astonished at the level of confusion out in the electorate as to how preferences work.
I've been asked the question thousands of times, I'm sure. Who will you direct preferences to? The fact of the matter is an independent doesn't, at least this independent, will not be directing preferences, which in any case is really only a way of saying what my how to vote card suggestions would recommend people to do. Now, I won't be using one, but there's a lot of confusion as to how the system actually works, and we should improve it. Obviously, campaign financing reform is very significant. I think that the anonymous donation threshold, having gone up about sixfold this last couple of years, is absolutely indefensible. I would follow Canada's lead, and I would ban any political contributions by businesses and by unions. They should only come from individual voters. It's only individual voters who go into that booth and cast their vote. I don't see why there should be a second sort of vote, if you like, for businesses and for unions. So a number of ways I would like to see reform there, and I think there are similarly many reforms we could undertake to our parliamentary processes, starting with question time, where I would limit the number of questions that any parliamentarian could ask in a session. Absolutely. I'm not sure what form that should best take. I imagine there are a number of alternatives there, but we've got to get control of this. We really must. It's, I think, an absolute disgrace. I cannot phrase it any other way. I think it's a disgrace. It is using taxpayer money for very thinly disguised electoral purposes. And that's outrageous, and we shouldn't permit it.